Episode titled Endless House. It was a normal morning. Everything in the pig family house was calm. Mummy Pig was cooking breakfast in the kitchen. Daddy Pig was sitting at the table reading a newspaper. Peppa came downstairs and said hello. George was playing on the floor with his dinosaur. Everything looked the same as always. After breakfast, Mummy Pig said they would go for a walk. Peppa was happy. George took his dinosaur. Daddy Pig folded the newspaper and walked to the door. Daddy Pig opened the front door. The yard should have been outside, but behind the door there was a hallway. It looked exactly like a hallway inside the house. Daddy Pig stopped. He looked outside, then back at the door. Mummy Pig came closer and said maybe they had opened the wrong door. Daddy Pig closed it and opened it again. The hallway was still there. Peppa looked inside. The hallway was long. It had the same walls, the same doors, and the same lamp on the ceiling. George quietly said, "Dinosaur." Daddy Pig decided to walk forward. Everyone followed him. They walked down the hallway for a few minutes. Then they saw a door. Daddy Pig opened it. Behind it was the kitchen, the same kitchen they had just left. Peppa was surprised. Mummy Pig said it was strange. Daddy Pig said they should try the back door. They walked through the kitchen and opened another door. But behind it there was another hallway. This one was slightly darker. Peppa felt that the house had become bigger. They walked on. The hallway became longer. There were more doors. Some doors led to the living room. Some led back to the kitchen. One door led to Peppa and George's room, even though it should have been upstairs. Peppa started counting steps. After 50 steps, they found the stairs again. But the stairs did not go up. They went down. Daddy Pig said it was impossible. Mummy Pig held Peppa's hand. George stayed close. They decided to go back to the front door. But when they reached the place, the door was gone. In its place was a family photo. In the photo, the family was standing near the entrance of the house. But behind them was a long hallway. In the evening, the house became quiet. They were still looking for a way out. Peppa opened door after door. Behind each one was another part of the house. Sometimes she heard steps ahead, but saw no one. Sometimes behind a door there was the same room, but their things were already inside. Daddy Pig stopped joking. Mummy Pig spoke more quietly. George became more silent. At night they reached the living room, but the living room was very long. The sofa stood far away, almost in the dark. Peppa looked out the window. There was no street outside. There was another hallway. In that hallway stood another pig family. They were looking through the window from the other side. In the morning, everything looked normal. Mummy Pig was cooking breakfast. Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper. George was playing with his dinosaur. Peppa came downstairs and said hello. Then she looked at the front door. It was there. Peppa walked closer and opened it. Behind the door was a hallway, and at the end of the hallway stood another Peppa, looking straight at her. Episode titled The Strange Shop. It was a normal morning. Mummy Pig was making breakfast. Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper. Peppa came downstairs and said, "Good morning." And George was playing with his dinosaur on the floor. After breakfast, the family decided to go to the city. Outside, everything felt calm. Shops were opening and people were walking along the street. Peppa held George's hand while he carried his dinosaur. As they walked, Peppa noticed a small shop standing slightly apart from the others. The sign above it was faded and the words were hard to read. The door was slightly open. Peppa said she wanted to take a look. Daddy Pig agreed, but said it would be quick. They stepped inside. The shop was quiet. The shelves were filled with toys. There were dolls, cars, and soft animals. Everything looked new, but there was no shopkeeper. Peppa picked up a toy. It felt nice to hold. She placed it back. George walked to a shelf and placed his dinosaur next to the other toys. He said, "Dinosaur," and looked at them. Then he got distracted and walked away. A minute later, he came back. His dinosaur was gone. He looked at the shelf again. There were many similar toys, but none of them were exactly his. George started looking around. He walked between the shelves and quietly repeated, "Dinosaur." Peppa helped him search. It felt like there were more toys than before. Some of them looked familiar. She looked closer and realized they resembled toys children had been holding outside. Daddy Pig said it was time to leave. George did not find his dinosaur and they left the shop. Outside, everything seemed normal again. But Peppa turned back for a moment. In the shop window, there were toys on display. Among them was George's dinosaur. It stood still. Peppa said nothing. In the evening, George sat at home and played with a new toy. It looked similar to his dinosaur, but slightly different. He quietly said, "Dinosaur," but sometimes paused, as if waiting for a response. At night, Peppa woke up. She thought she heard a sound from the hallway. She stepped outside and saw toys on the floor. There were more than during the day. Among them was George's dinosaur. It lay slightly apart from the others. Peppa did not pick it up. In the morning, everything seemed normal. There were fewer toys again. George was playing and smiling. But when Peppa looked at the shelf, it felt like one toy was missing. Episode titled Endless Creepy Rain. It was a normal morning at the Pig family house. Mummy Pig was preparing breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper, and Peppa and George were playing in their room. Everything felt calm, but then the sky began to grow dark and the house became dimmer. Peppa looked out of the window and saw something strange. The rain had started falling, but it wasn't normal. It was black. At first, Peppa didn't understand what was happening. She stepped closer to the window and watched as the rain fell to the ground, leaving dark streaks, and the air seemed to carry a strange smell. "Mummy! Daddy!" Peppa called out. "What is this?" Mummy Pig peeked out the window and felt a shiver run down her spine. This wasn't just rain. This was dark, endless rain that wouldn't stop. It kept falling, and with each drop, something in the air felt more unsettling. "Daddy, what do we do?" Peppa asked. Daddy Pig tried to reassure them. "Don't worry," he said. "It's just a strange storm. We'll stay inside, and everything will be fine." But despite his words, Peppa felt more anxious with every passing moment. The world outside the window seemed to vanish. She could hear the rain tapping on the roof, and every sound felt strange. This rain wasn't normal. It was dark, and it was endless. As the hours passed, the rain grew stronger. The house became darker, and even the lamps inside couldn't seem to light up the space, and the air felt thick with the weight of the rain. Peppa sat with George in her room, trying not to think about what was happening outside. That evening, as the family gathered in the living room, they heard strange noises. The rain wasn't stopping, but now it sounded like whispers. The noise was barely audible, but it was enough to make Peppa's heart race. "What's that?" she whispered. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig exchanged a glance. They couldn't tell what was going on. For a moment, Peppa felt something moving in the house. She turned and saw that one of the window panes had become even darker. The rain wasn't just black. It was like it was seeping inside, obscuring everything. The lights flickered. The room was plunged into total darkness. Peppa was terrified and gripped George's hand tightly. "We need to stay together," said Mummy Pig, trying to remain calm. But in that moment, Peppa noticed that something had changed outside. The dark rain had started to thicken, and strange shadows appeared outside the window. Shadows that didn't belong to any animals, any people. They were figures, moving on their own. The whispers grew louder. Peppa and her family heard them more clearly, as if something was right outside. "We can't go out," Peppa said. "This rain won't stop." They all huddled in the living room, and Mummy Pig turned on every lamp to light up the room. But despite the light, the darkness outside grew deeper. Suddenly, they heard a knock on the window. Peppa ran to the window and peeked outside. She saw silhouettes of people or creatures standing in the shadow. She quickly closed the curtains and ran to her parents. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a storm. It was something more. All night, Peppa and her family hid in the house while the rain continued to pour. It was endless, and there was no sound to comfort them. Peppa felt like something was watching them. This rain was something terrible. When morning came, the rain still hadn't stopped. But when Peppa approached the window, she noticed that the darkness outside had started to recede. She saw the first light of the day breaking through the black drops. The rain was finally beginning to stop, and the world was becoming visible again. But Peppa still felt a strange, uneasy fear in her heart. The rain had stayed with her. Episode titled Cursed Fridge. It was a normal morning in the Pig family house. Mummy Pig was making breakfast. Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper. Peppa was playing with George when Peppa noticed a strange corner of the kitchen. In it stood a refrigerator she had never seen before. It was tall, old, with a dark metal door slightly flickering in the morning light. Peppa approached and sniffed it. The smell was strange, cold, and slightly sweet. Curiosity took over. Peppa opened the door, and a blast of cold air hit her. Inside it was dark, but she saw a small glowing space, as if the refrigerator was not a normal fridge, but a tiny tunnel. She leaned in, and suddenly the door slammed shut behind her. Peppa tried to open it, but the handle was heavy, as if some magical force was holding her inside. Peppa started to panic. She pushed, pulled, but the door wouldn't budge. The light inside the refrigerator was strange, changing from bright blue to dim red. Peppa saw her reflection on the wall, but it was slightly wrong. The eyes were wider and the smile too large. Peppa shivered and stepped back. Inside the fridge, the space seemed bigger than it should be. Boxes and bottles were arranged like a narrow corridor. Peppa walked forward, and the corridor stretched endlessly. Occasionally, she heard faint creaks and rustles, as if someone was walking nearby. But when she turned, no one was there. She called, "Mummy! Daddy! George!" But her voice echoed and disappeared into the strange space. She found a small door deeper inside the refrigerator. She opened it and entered an even stranger section, darker with heavy air. Peppa felt the refrigerator watching every movement. She tried to go back, but the path had vanished. It seemed the fridge itself was changing the corridors, trapping her. Time inside became distorted. Clocks on the walls spun too fast or slowed down completely. Peppa felt tired but kept walking, searching for an exit. Suddenly, she saw a small light at the end of the corridor. She ran toward it, hoping for freedom. When the light reached the door, Peppa pushed it hard and emerged into the kitchen. The refrigerator was in its place, but looked old and normal. It no longer flickered. Peppa sat on the floor, catching her breath. Mummy Pig came over and hugged her. "Peppa, what happened?" she asked. Peppa could not explain at once. She only stared at the refrigerator. It seemed to flicker slightly in the corner again. Her heart was racing. She knew this strange refrigerator was not ordinary, and she understood that some things in the house are better left alone. Episode titled Creepy Copies. It was a normal morning at the Pig family house. Mummy Pig was cooking breakfast, Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper, and Peppa was playing in her room. Suddenly, she noticed something strange in the kitchen. She walked over to the door, peered inside, and froze. There, standing at the table, was a copy of herself. "Peppa!" Mummy Pig called out, but Peppa didn't respond as her copy smiled and took a step aside, mimicking her every move. "Mum!" Peppa shouted, but when she turned around, the copy had disappeared. Peppa thought it must have been her imagination. She returned to her room and resumed playing. However, the next morning, when Peppa entered the kitchen, the situation repeated itself. This time, the copy was dressed differently, and there was something off about her. Her smile was wider and her eyes brighter. She stood at the table, staring at Peppa. Peppa froze. "Mom!" she shouted again, but Mummy Pig didn't notice anything strange. Everything seemed fine. Peppa began to fear that her imagination was playing tricks on her, but the strange occurrences continued. Every morning, when she entered the kitchen or the living room, she would see a new copy of herself. They looked similar, but each time something changed. One copy was slightly taller, another had a more vacant, strange expression on her face. Sometimes they just stood there watching, and other times they would mimic Peppa's actions. Peppa tried to ignore them, but the more she did, the more they appeared. One evening, after Peppa returned from the garden, she heard someone laughing in her room. It was her laugh, but with an unsettling edge to it. Peppa walked into the room and saw a group of her copies. They were all sitting, watching her and giggling. Each copy was slightly different from the last, and their laughter had taken on an eerie quality. Peppa felt a chill down her spine and tried to leave, but the door was locked. She was trapped. The copies began moving toward her, mimicking her every movement, as if they were her, but with something darker in their eyes. "You can't leave," one of the copies said. "We are all part of you." Peppa was terrified. She tried to escape, but no door would open. Everything felt like a nightmare. Each copy seemed to want to replace her. Soon, all the copies disappeared. Peppa woke up in her room. She wasn't sure if it had been a dream or reality, but she definitely felt that something was wrong. The next morning, Peppa woke up and, as usual, went to the kitchen. But her heart stopped when she saw that sitting at the table was a new copy of herself. This one had an even stranger smile and eyes.